Hi, my name is Mikołaj Kurpios and I'm responsible for the production of sound and music in Against the Storm. It's a roguelite city builder developed by RMI Games. The player's task is to settle the unknown wilds and manage the growing population of beavers, lizards, humans and harpies. By design, Against the Storm is all about embracing the challenge and playing the hand you're dealt. So in this video I'm going to take you through some of the challenges I had while working on the game, show you how I tried to work with what I had and how it influenced my decisions in 4 categories: music, ambiences, sound effects and voice acting. Let's start with what I knew before I even started to work. I wanted to create both sounds and music on my own, especially taking into account that for a long time the project was made after hours on a zero budget by a 5-person team. The plan was to work on the audio layer of the game from the early stages of the development and continue it over years, as the game was planned to be released in early access. And possibly the most important part, there was an assumption that players would spend up to dozens of hours in the game, so player fatigue was probably my biggest fear. Summing those up, the main question was how to create an interactive and immersive audio structure while not imposing too much fatigue on the players, and how to plan it well in order not to lose too much time in the process. Firstly, I was interested in how the team imagined the soundtrack. All the soundtracks they mentioned as a reference were based on piano, strings, flutes, harps and other classical instruments. Some of them were recorded by real orchestras and instrumentalists, but the majority were produced with old VSTs. I was happy with this fact, as I was pretty sure that we wouldn't be able to afford to record live instrumentalists. Also, I didn't want the music to sound too classical because graphically the game was abstract in some way. In my project I mainly used the classic VSTs from East-West libraries. For me those were a sweet spot between the sound of a real orchestra and older VSTs, as they are a little outdated now. In terms of the effects, I mainly use a lot of reverbs and filters to make the music more spacious and blurry. Here's how my project looks like. So let's go through my VSTs. Here you can see a few types of drums I rarely used, then different synthesizers, 3 bass layers, 3 piano tracks, 3 harps, glockenspiel, a banjo, clavichord, 5 types of flutes, a Tibetan horn, some brass instruments, various types of strings and 3 tracks of female vocals. Down here we also have some audio tracks like bird sounds, my whistling and voice recordings, usually transposed down. Here's the ukulele, the electric guitar, then the second guitar plugged into a different amplifier, and at the end there are some sound effects and a marimba track I decided not to export in the final version of the soundtrack. It's a lot of tracks, so it won't be possible to go through all of them, but I will come back to the one particular sound later in this video in a detailed way, as there is a story connected to it. So at this time I had the main vision of the music's general tone, but before I started to produce anything I still needed to know how it should work in the game. At this point, Against the Storm already had 3 species: beavers, lizards and humans, 1 biome that was a rainy forest, and different seasons. The idea of writing the music tailored to a specific species or biome was tempting, but those 2 solutions generated a lot of questions, like for example, what if someone plays mainly with 1 race? Wouldn't it impose fatigue much quicker? How many species would we add in the process, and how different should the music be? How much music should each species have, and would I be able to write more music on time when the new species come to the game? The biomes had all the same problems, and at this point we had no doubts that it would get even more complicated with time. So generally speaking, seasons started to look like a wise choice, because each gameplay on each biome, regardless of the race is chosen, always had 3 seasons. Even in the early stages of the game production, the drizzle season looked casually rainy and seemed ordinary and calm. The clearance season was very sunny, with much lighter rain, and felt like a big relief for the player. The storm, on the other hand, was very unpleasant, painful and visually dark. So the difference between them was very perceptible to me already, and I felt I knew how to fit each of those with my music. There was one more thing though. I remember being afraid of the fact that the time in the game was relative. Players could stop the game and still develop the city or make the time pass faster whenever they needed, so practically, depending on the player choices, the seasons had random duration. I was simply not able to predict how many tracks in a row would be heard and at which point exactly the tracks would stop. I recorded around 25 minutes of drafts and we implemented them to test it, and the feedback was positive. The differences between the seasons worked well, and on top of that we noticed that the random duration of the seasons wasn't bad at all. The music was drawn on shuffle from separate playlists for each season, while each season was changing the playlist duration in some way. It just worked to our advantage as it was diversifying the whole experience, and I was happy. Then another problem appeared. The team mentioned that the whole music felt a little too narrative and it was telling too much story, which apparently wasn't what we really needed in a roguelite city builder. The music was simply distracting us from playing the game. Later in the process I realized that the game simply felt slower than the music that I wrote. I slowed the drafts down by around 50 to even 80% and gave it a try. So here's what the difference looked like. Here's the version with a faster track. And here's another with the slower one. So after being slowed down, the music seemed to fit the scene much better and moved to the background, and as a bonus we gained around 10 minutes of gameplay music with one simple trick, so I was doubly happy. Now, I promised I would come back to one particular sound, so here's the quick story about the whistle. In the early stages of working on music drafts, one melody popped into my mind while I was cooking and at the same time listening to the drafts from the other room. The keyboard in my studio was disconnected, so while waiting for my dinner to get cooked, I just ran to the studio and whistled the melody to the microphone in order not to forget it. Later, after listening to the new melody a few times, I felt like the whistling sound itself added some fresh twist to the draft I worked on, and I didn't want to have a clearly recognizable human whistle in the tracks as it sounded cheesy as a choice, but trying to make it a little more interesting, I copied it and changed the transposition of one track to -12. After I added reverb and balanced the volumes between those two, it started to sound a little like an inaccurate vocal of some kind. The team liked it, it added a mysterious feeling to some of the tracks, and that's how the melody whistled quickly into the microphone stayed with us to the end. Let's move to the sound part. I wanted the ambience loops to play a big part in the soundscape and complement the music in the background. The game was about the rain, its type was changing each season and it was visually exposed in each part of the game, so I decided to try to keep the rain present sonically everywhere. Of course, I was afraid of a few things. The rain sound could cause fatigue even faster than other sounds, especially since for some people the rain itself can be depressing and the sound is humming. So I knew it had to be carefully balanced with the music and sounds in order not to overwhelm the full scene. But on the other hand, try searching for relaxing rain sounds on YouTube. That's what I did in the first place. There's a lot of videos like this and they are super popular. For many people, the sound of rain is relaxing and even helps to focus them on work or studying, so I decided to give it a try. So I started to test it and it turned out that it wasn't annoying for anyone on the team, and in our feeling it was making the whole forest scene alive, so I started to experiment more and I connected the ambient speed to the game speed, so when the player accelerated the game it sounded a little different. I also set the speed to 0 at pause, so whenever the player stopped the game to focus on what to do, it stopped raining while the music was still playing in the background. So the music was simply telling the player that the game was on, but the world he was building was quiet because it wasn't moving. This also meant that ambience wouldn't be present in the game all the time, leaving some space for the music to be in the front once in a while, which made the soundscape even more complex and gave more occasions for the player's ears to have some rest from the rain. So the final versions of the ambience consist mainly of my field recordings, I recorded various forests, birds, winds, thunder, various types of rain from different distances, and many others. These vary between the seasons, and each biome has its own set of ambiances, meaning that together with the speed changes, there are dozens of variants of the rain itself that you can hear while playing. This diversity, together with a decent volume balance, was what helped us to keep the rain present all the time without imposing too much fatigue on the players. So even though we already had a rich background, I still needed different game aspects to be more interactive and the whole soundscape to be even richer. I ended up implementing more than 300 different sound effects, so let's split them into two categories and try to quickly see how they work in the game. The first category is informative sounds, so all the UI clicks and all the ones that signalize something to the player, like for example opening and closing the banners, clicking the buttons, getting new orders and fulfilling ones, accepting new villagers, building, rotating and destroying the buildings, opening different glades, and many more. The second group consists of all the additional sounds that complement the soundscape in different ways. Some examples are having the fire fired up in the hearth, opening different buildings, gathering resources, different glade event sounds, marking the trees and unmarking them, wood cutting sounds that vary between the tree types, and many more. During the process I spent hours recording the sounds of cutting wood with a saw, throwing random objects on the floor, shaking plants, shouting and doing many other things that my neighbors possibly hate me for, but I think it was worth it, as even though part of the sounds weren't really necessary, it surely made the soundscape much more complex and helped with the possible fatigue problem too. So now I already had music, a lot of different rain noises and just added hundreds of sound effects to the game, but on the other hand I always liked the characters in games like Stronghold, Age of Empires and Sims in terms of how they were reacting vocally when clicked or sent somewhere. That was the starting point for the voice acting for the game. The problems I saw from the beginning were I didn't want the same sounds to repeat too often, so I needed many variants of them. We were planning to have at least 3 different species in different genders, making it 6 variants from the start. Each species had a resolve meter that was showing the satisfaction level of villagers, so I had to take it into account. And we planned to localize the game to different languages, and I still wanted to do it all in-house. At this time the pandemic was one of the additional reasons for it too. So it looked like a lot of work, so I had to think about how to make it simple. To avoid localization problems, I came up with inventing different languages for each species, so those could be universal for each player. During the process I wrote the whole list of random phrases inspired by Esperanto, Romanian languages and some random Polish books, and tried to come up with the voices in front of the mic while reading those out loud. I think it's possible. I recorded around 8,000 phrases with different voices and mood versions, just to end up with around 50 final files for each species. My whole plan seemed to work nicely until I was done with all the male characters, as I simply realized that I wouldn't be able to do all the female characters, even half as good as the male ones. As my girlfriend was just sitting in the next room, I got an idea and decided to ask her to help me. She had no experience in this kind of work, but I suggested she could try repeating all the phrases recorded to male villagers with her own voice. Long story short, we did a few tries and edits, and after adding the effects, it was done. The voices were better than mine. She did a great job helping me with all the female characters that appear in the game, and the process stayed in-house, so I was super happy about how it went. So, summing it all up, the lesson learned while working on Against the Storm was that while trying to make the whole experience as rich as possible, it was also crucial to understand what resources and limitations we had in the first place, as planning the work can make those limitations work to your advantage. And that's it. I hope you liked it. We're still developing Against the Storm, so don't forget to come by to our Discord channel, especially if you hate the rain sound or my music and want to share it with me. If you made it to the end, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for listening. Cheers!